Let me bring in Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor. You know a little bit about negotiations, so I wonder how you read this. Should we not be surprised that there might be some last-minute wrangling, given, as Raf just pointed out, the devilishly complex nature of everything that came before? Or do you sense a little nervousness, perhaps, with several items yet to be finalized, in the words of Bibi Netanyahu?
Well, I think we should not be surprised. I mean, part of what is so both simple and complicated about this, Chris, is that this is essentially the same deal that has been on the table since the spring. But there are these issues like the Philadelphia corridor that have kind of constantly been the back and forth in the negotiation, as well as just the general willingness by both Hamas and the Israeli government to take the leap into an agreement. And so I think part of this is just the difficulty of nailing down the precise details of something like what an IDF military deployment might look like in the Philadelphia corridor. But also, Chris, and you've covered politics, part of this is the political posturing, frankly, of how a deal is going to be framed. And I think for Netanyahu, he is trying to bring along people who are even further to his right in his coalition. And so, therefore, he's trying to signal in that statement. I mean, it's transparent. He wants it to appear that Hamas folded at the last minute on something as a means of kind of shoring up his political support for this agreement. So I think it's a combination of nailing down the final details of some of the most contentious aspects of the agreement. But I think it's also the kind of preliminary framing from both Hamas and certainly from what we heard in that statement from the Israeli government, so that they're in a stronger position when they do go out to announce it, to say that they extracted, concession at the end, or that they, prevailed in a negotiation. And so I think we're in that interim period where there's pretty much an agreement, but parties are also trying to begin to frame how that agreement is announced and received publicly. And I think that has to do with internal politics as well. But when you have this degree of momentum and this degree of assurance that an agreement is coming, it would be, to me, very surprising if somehow we don't hear that final announcement in the coming hours.
Joe Biden is expected to speak publicly soon. This is something that was probably the biggest thing on his agenda that had not yet been resolved. He's made no secret of the fact how hard he has had his team working on this and how much it has meant to him personally. What would you expect to hear from him?
Well, I think we heard a bit of a preview of how he kind of is framing the completion of his presidency in his foreign policy speech the other day, in which, he obviously defended his support for Israel throughout this process, while lamenting the suffering of the Palestinian people. I think this was obviously an extraordinarily painful period that is a definitional issue for President Biden and his legacy on foreign policy. I think, you'll hear him talk about how hard he and his team have worked to try to recover the hostages and try to bring about an end to the conflict. Look, I mean, I think the reality also is that the timing is conspicuous. Donald Trump has made it known since he was elected that he wanted this completed by the time he took office. And Donald Trump has a lot of leverage right now as it relates to Prime Minister Netanyahu, in some ways precisely because they are more like-minded. They're kind of more strongman types on the political right. And so I think, we have to acknowledge that this is both the outcome of, negotiations, not just by the United States, but by Qatar and Egypt and obviously Israel and Hamas and others, but also this kind of convergence of the end of the Biden administration and the beginning of the Trump administration. The timing of both men, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, had a lot of interest in this being done by January 20th. And I think it's that timing that seems to have pushed over the goal line.
And we did see that before we heard from Joe Biden, we got a statement taking credit from Donald Trump. Having said that, let me ask you the question that I asked Senator Coons, which is, do you think that this bodes well, potentially, for what may happen going forward, at least the things inside of what we expect to be Marco Rubio's purview. He is expected to be confirmed as Secretary of State. The fact that the outgoing and incoming administration were able to work together to apparently get us to this point. We will see when somebody comes to the podium there in Doha. But what do you think it portends?
You know, honestly, Chris, I don't want to overstate that. I mean, first of all, Marco Rubio was always going to be the easiest confirmation of the national security appointments in terms of Democratic votes. But in terms of this issue, the reality is there's not a lot of difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration's approach to the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. I mean, that's part of the reason why, you know, I've been somewhat critical over the last several months. I think what is most important today is that hostages hopefully are going to be released and reunited with their families, and that the people of Gaza, who've suffered hell on earth, have the potential to get peace for a period at least and assistance in. But going forward, on the question of this conflict itself, this is not the end. Even if you get to that phase 3, which is the ceasefire, there's still the question of the future of Gaza, who's going to be administering Gaza, what's the future of Palestinian governance in Gaza, what's the future of Hamas. The West Bank is very volatile. So this does not end the conflict or the underlying conditions that brought about the conflict in Gaza or the West Bank. That will continue to be a challenge for the Trump administration. And then in terms of kind of bipartisanship, look, this issue is, you know, uniquely been a bipartisan one, not just the last couple of months, but, you know, there's broad support for the Israeli government in the U.S. Congress. And that we've not seen that lead to bipartisan cooperation on other issues, Chris. So I think we have to, you know, this is the reality. This is an issue in which Joe Biden and Donald Trump don't have a lot of daylight between them. And if anything, I think, you know, Trump giving this a bit of a push because there was this convergence of interest in the timing of the Trump inauguration as a time to get this done. Yes, that was an interesting and successful, hopefully, coordination between them. But I don't think it augurs bipartisan cooperation on issues that are not related to this.